He thought calling her worthless would end the conversation right there. But he had no idea he had just triggered the moment everyone in that room would remember for the rest of their lives. The glass doors slid open with a soft whisper as Evelyn Carter stepped into the towering lobby, sunlight pouring through 40-foot windows and reflecting across polished marble floors that stretched wider than a basketball court. Executives in tailored suits moved with purpose, their voices low, their confidence louder than anything they said. And then there was Evelyn, standing quietly in a simple gray coat, her shoes worn but clean, her presence almost invisible if you weren't looking closely. But Daniel Brooks noticed. He always noticed anything that didn't belong. His sharp eyes scanned her from head to toe, a slow smirk forming as he adjusted his cufflinks, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he already believed the answer was no. Evelyn's voice was calm, almost too calm for a place like this. "I'm here for a meeting," she said, her hands resting lightly at her sides. No rush, no hesitation. But Daniel let out a short laugh, not loud enough to cause a scene, just enough for the nearby staff to notice. "A meeting?" he repeated, glancing at his colleagues who exchanged knowing looks. "I think you're in the wrong building," he added, his voice sharpening just enough to draw attention. A few heads turned, the subtle shift in the room beginning, the quiet judgment that spreads faster than words. Evelyn didn't move, didn't argue. She simply stood there, her eyes steady, taking in the moment as if she had seen it all before. Daniel took a step closer now, lowering his voice but somehow making it cut deeper. "This building houses companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars," he said. "We don't usually have walk-ins." The implication hung heavy in the air. A couple of people nearby let out faint chuckles, the kind that try to stay polite but fail. And then he said it, the word that would echo far longer than he expected. "You don't belong here. You're wasting everyone's time." A pause, a breath, and then colder, sharper. "Honestly, people like you are just worthless." The room shifted, not louder, but tighter, as if the air itself had been pulled inward. And for a moment, everything stilled. But Evelyn Carter didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She didn't shrink. Instead, something almost imperceptible changed. The smallest lift of her chin, the quietest shift in her posture, and in that silence, something else began to unfold, something Daniel Brooks would realize far too late, because the woman he had just dismissed wasn't out of place at all. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The silence did not break right away. It stretched, thin and fragile, as if the entire 40,000 square foot lobby was holding its breath. A few employees shifted uncomfortably. Others pretended to return to their work, but their eyes lingered, drawn back to the quiet woman who had just been dismissed so easily. Daniel Brooks exhaled sharply, clearly expecting her to turn around, to apologize, or at the very least to leave, because that was how these moments usually ended. People like her did not argue. They retreated, but Evelyn Carter did none of that. Instead, she reached slowly into her bag, her movements unhurried, almost deliberate, and for the first time, Daniel's confidence flickered, just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel it. "Ma'am, I am going to have to ask you to leave," he said again, firmer this time, as if repeating it would restore control. But Evelyn did not respond to his words. She pulled out her phone, glanced at the screen for a brief second, then placed a call, holding it to her ear with a calm that did not match the tension around her. A few people exchanged glances, the kind that asked silent questions. What is she doing? Why is she still here? Daniel let out a short, impatient laugh, shaking his head as he turned slightly toward his colleagues. "This is exactly what I was talking about," he muttered, loud enough to be heard. But Evelyn's voice cut softly through the space, not raised, not emotional, just steady. "Yes, I am in the lobby," she said into the phone, pausing as she listened. "No." There seems to be some confusion. Another pause, her eyes lifting, meeting Daniel's for the first time, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, certainty. "I think you should come down," she finished, and ended the call, the phone lowering back to her side. And then nothing, no explanation, no defense, just silence again, heavier now, charged in a way that made even the most confident people in the room feel slightly off balance. Daniel frowned, irritation creeping back in. "Calling someone is not going to change anything," he said, his voice sharper now, but it lacked the ease it had before, because something had shifted, something small but undeniable. And then it happened. One phone rang, sharp and sudden in the quiet, followed by another, and then another, a ripple of sound moving across the lobby as several executives instinctively reached for their devices. Confusion spreading across their faces as they read the same incoming alert. Daniel's phone buzzed in. His hand, he glanced down, expecting a routine notification, but what he saw made his expression freeze, the color draining just enough to notice. The message was brief, direct, and impossible to ignore, and for the first time since Evelyn had walked through those doors, Daniel Brooks did not speak. He just stood there, staring at the screen. As the room slowly began to understand that something much bigger than a simple misunderstanding had just begun to unfold. The room did not return to normal. It could not, because whatever had just appeared on those screens was not something people could simply ignore. One by one, the quiet murmurs faded into a heavy stillness, the kind that settles when everyone realizes they have misunderstood something important. Daniel Brooks stared at his phone as if the message might change if he blinked, but it did not. The subject line remained exactly the same. Urgent executive notice, and beneath it, a single line that shifted everything. Ownership verification in progress. Stand by for confirmation. His fingers tightened slightly around the device, his mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. Around him, others were having the same reaction. Shoulders stiffening, brows furrowing, conversations dying mid-sentence. And then the elevator doors at the far end of the lobby opened with a soft chime that seemed louder than it should have been. Every head turned. A group of senior executives stepped out, their pace quick, their expressions focused in a way that commanded attention without a single word being spoken. These were not people who rushed without reason, and today, they were moving with purpose, straight toward the center of the lobby, straight toward Evelyn Carter. Daniel felt it before he understood it. That subtle shift in power that no title or suit could protect him from. He straightened instinctively, forcing a polite expression back onto his face, as if he could still control the situation. But control had already slipped through his fingers. The lead executive approached Evelyn and stopped just a few feet away, his voice respectful, almost careful. "Ms. Carter, we were not expecting you this early," he said, and just like that, the room changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Evelyn inclined her head slightly, her posture unchanged, her calm unwavering. "I prefer to see things as they are," she replied, her voice still soft, still steady, but now carrying a weight that no one could dismiss. Daniel's breath caught for a fraction of a second, his mind trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he knew. The man he had seen as out of place was now being addressed with quiet deference by the very people who defined this building. The same building he had just used as proof that she did not belong. A ripple moved through the crowd, not laughter this time, but realization, sharp and immediate. A few employees looked down, others stepped back slightly, as if distance could separate them from what had just happened. Daniel finally found his voice, though it did not sound like it had before. "I was not aware," he began, but the words felt hollow even as he said them. Evelyn turned her gaze toward him, not harsh, not angry, just clear, and in that moment, he understood something he had missed entirely. This was never about proving anything. It was about revealing what was already true. The executive beside her glanced briefly at Daniel, then back to Evelyn, waiting, because the next move was not his to make. It was hers, and the room, once filled with quiet judgment, now waited in a different kind of silence, the kind that comes when respect arrives all at once, uninvited but undeniable. Daniel Brooks felt the weight of every eye in the room shift, not toward Evelyn, but toward him, and for the first time in years, he did not know where to place his hands, his voice, or his authority. The marble floors that once echoed with confidence now seemed to magnify every second of silence. The senior executive standing beside Evelyn remained composed, waiting, because in this moment, hierarchy had quietly rearranged itself, and everyone could feel it. Evelyn Carter did not raise her voice. She did not step forward. She simply looked at Daniel with a calm that was more powerful than any accusation. "You said I did not belong here," she spoke, her tone even, measured, each word landing clearly in the still air. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out right away, his earlier certainty now replaced with hesitation. "I was trying to maintain standards," he finally said. Though even he could hear how thin it sounded, Evelyn tilted her head slightly, not in judgment, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if she had heard that explanation many times before. "Standards are important," she replied, "but they reveal more about the person enforcing them than the person they are applied to." A faint ripple moved through the crowd, not laughter, not agreement spoken aloud, but something deeper, recognition. Daniel swallowed, his posture stiff, his mind searching for ground that was no longer there. "There was a misunderstanding," he added quickly, attempting to regain control, but the words did not carry the authority they once did, because the room had already decided what it had witnessed. Evelyn's gaze did not waver. "No," she said softly. There was clarity, and that word settled heavier than anything else she could have said, because it did not accuse, it defined. The executive beside her shifted slightly, stepping forward just enough to address the surrounding staff, his voice firm but controlled. "Effective immediately, all access protocols will be reviewed," he announced, but his eyes flicked briefly toward Daniel, not with anger, but with something colder. Consequence. A few employees straightened, others avoided eye contact entirely. The invisible lines of power had redrawn themselves completely. Daniel felt it in the tightening of his chest, in the way no one moved to support him, in the way the space around him seemed to widen just enough to isolate him without a single step being taken. Evelyn reached into her bag once more, but this time she did not take out her phone. Instead, she produced a small, simple card, handing it to the executive without ceremony. He glanced at it, then nodded with immediate understanding, confirming what the entire room had already begun to realize. She had never been an outsider, not for a second. She had simply chosen not to announce herself, and that choice had revealed everything about everyone else. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in the quiet recognition of a moment he could not reverse. Evelyn turned to leave, her steps as calm as when she had entered. No rush, no need to linger, because the lesson had already been delivered. And as the glass doors opened once more, letting in the afternoon light, the room remained silent, not out of tension this time, but out of something far more lasting. Respect that had arrived too late to prevent the mistake, but not too late to remember it. The doors closed softly behind Evelyn Carter, but the impact of her presence did not leave with her. It lingered in the air, in the posture of every employee, in the silence that no one rushed to break. The lobby that once felt like a place of controlled authority now felt different, as if something invisible had been exposed and could not be hidden again. Daniel Brooks remained standing where he was, his phone still in his hand, though the screen had long gone dark, his reflection faintly visible in the polished marble beneath his feet. And for the first time, he saw himself the way others had just seen him, not as the confident executive who controlled the room, but as someone who had spoken too quickly, judged too easily, and revealed more than he intended. A junior associate nearby shifted slightly, then stepped forward, hesitating before speaking. "Sir, should we proceed with the afternoon briefing?" she asked carefully, her voice respectful, but different now, more measured. Daniel blinked, pulling himself back into the moment. "Yes," he said, though the word came slower than usual, less certain. He adjusted his jacket, a familiar motion that once grounded him, but today it felt like a habit without effect. Across the lobby, quiet conversations began again, but they were not the same. There was a caution now, a subtle awareness in every glance, every word, as if everyone had just been reminded of something they had forgotten. The executive who had greeted Evelyn earlier turned toward Daniel, his expression neutral, professional, but firm. "We will need a full report on what happened here," he said, not loudly, not aggressively, but with the kind of clarity that left no room for interpretation. Daniel nodded once, understanding that this was not a request. "Of course," he replied, his voice steadying slightly, though the weight behind it remained. The executive gave a brief nod and walked away, leaving Daniel standing in a space that felt larger than before, not physically, but in meaning, because now there was distance between him and the authority he once carried so easily. Minutes passed. The Rhythm of the building slowly returning, footsteps echoing again, phones ringing, conversations resuming. But something fundamental had shifted, not in the structure of the company, but in the awareness of the people inside it. Daniel finally moved, walking toward the large glass windows that overlooked the city, cars moving below like a steady current, life continuing without pause. He placed his hands lightly on the cool surface, staring out, but not really seeing the streets. Instead, replaying a single moment, a single word. Worthless, it echoed differently now, stripped of the certainty he had given it, replaced with something far heavier, realization. Behind him, the lobby continued, business carried on, but the lesson remained, quiet, unspoken, and impossible to ignore, because that day was not defined by who owned the building or who held the highest title. It was defined by a moment when assumption met truth, and truth did not need to raise its voice to be heard. It only needed to stand still long enough for everyone else to finally see it. The afternoon stretched into evening, but for Daniel Brooks, time did not move the same way it had before. Every interaction felt sharper, every word more deliberate, as if the invisible shield he once carried had been quietly removed. He returned to his office on the 32nd floor, the city skyline glowing beyond the glass. A view that once symbolized achievement now felt strangely distant. He set his phone down on the desk, but his mind remained fixed on the lobby below, on the moment. Everything shifted without warning. A soft knock broke the silence. "Come in," he said, his voice controlled. The senior executive stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. There was no tension in his posture, no raised voice, just a calm presence that carried more weight than any confrontation. "We have reviewed the footage," he began, his tone measured. Daniel nodded once, already understanding what that meant. "I take full responsibility," he replied, the words coming easier now. Not because the situation had improved, but because resisting it no longer made sense. The executive studied him for a brief moment, then spoke again. "This is not about a single interaction," he said. "It is about judgment, and how quickly it was made." Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, because there was no argument left to offer, only understanding. The executive placed a thin folder on the desk. "There will be changes," he continued, "not just in protocol, but in leadership expectations." Daniel looked at the folder, but did not open it right away. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he had been holding for years. "Understood," he said quietly. The executive gave a small nod, then turned to leave, pausing at the door for just a second. "She chose not to escalate this further," he added, without turning back, and with that, he stepped out, leaving the room silent once more. Daniel remained seated, his hands resting on the desk, the weight of those words settling deeper than anything else that had happened that day. She chose, not forced, not demanded, but chose, and in that choice, there was a kind of strength he had not recognized before. He finally opened the folder, scanning the contents, not rushing, not resisting, just reading, because this time, he understood the cost of not paying attention. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one, steady and indifferent, life continuing as it always did. But inside that office, something had changed permanently, not in title, not in position, but in perspective. Daniel leaned back slightly, his reflection faint in the glass behind the desk, and for the first time, he did not see the authority he once relied on. He saw the moment that redefined it, not as control, not as status, but as something far quieter, far harder to earn, and far easier to lose. And somewhere beyond that building, Evelyn Carter continued her day as if nothing unusual had happened, because for her, it had not. It was simply another moment where the world revealed itself exactly as it was, and she had already learned long ago how to stand steady within it. The next morning arrived with a quiet clarity that felt different from any day before. The sun rising over the city in slow, steady light, casting long reflections across the glass towers that once symbolized certainty, but now felt more like reminders. Daniel Brooks stood in front of the same building, but this time he did not walk in immediately. He paused just outside the entrance, watching as employees passed by him, some greeting him politely, others with a subtle hesitation that had not been there before. Not disrespect, but awareness, the kind that cannot be undone once it has been seen. He adjusted his tie, not out of habit, but out of intention, then stepped inside. The lobby greeted him with the same marble floors, the same polished surfaces, the same quiet hum of business. But the atmosphere had changed, not in sound, but in feeling. Conversations were softer, interactions more measured, as if everyone had collectively learned something without being told. A receptionist looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks," she said, her tone respectful. But there was something else in it now, something grounded, something real. Daniel nodded in return. "Good morning," he replied, his voice calm, steady, without the edge it once carried. He moved through the space without rushing, without asserting presence, simply walking, observing, noticing. Details he had overlooked before, the way people interacted, the way small moments revealed more than titles ever could. In the corner of the lobby, a young employee struggled slightly with a stack of documents, papers shifting out of alignment. Daniel stopped, just for a second, then stepped forward. "Here, let me help you with that," he said. Reaching out to steady the stack, the employee looked surprised, then grateful. "Thank you, sir," she replied. Daniel gave a small nod. "Of course," he said, and continued on his way. The moment simple, almost insignificant, but different in a way that mattered, because this time, it was not about control, it was about awareness. As he reached the elevator, the doors opened, and for a brief second, he saw his reflection in the mirrored surface, but it did not look the same, not because anything external had changed, but because something internal had shifted. The elevator ascended smoothly, floor by floor, each number lighting up in quiet progression, and with each second, Daniel felt something settle, not the confidence he once carried, but something steadier, something earned. When the doors opened again, he stepped out into the executive floor, the same offices, the same structure, but approached now with a different understanding, because the lesson from the day before had not been about losing authority, it had been about redefining it. And somewhere beyond the reach of that building, Evelyn Carter moved through her own world with the same quiet certainty, unchanged by recognition, unaffected by judgment, because she had never needed either. And that was the difference, the kind that could not be taught in a meeting, could not be written in a report, but could be felt in a single moment when everything became clear, and once seen, could never be unseen. By midday, the building no longer felt like a place that simply functioned. It felt like a place that remembered, not in words, not in policies posted on walls, but in the way people carried themselves through the space. Daniel Brooks noticed it in the smallest interactions, a pause before speaking, a second glance before assuming, a subtle shift in tone when addressing someone who might have once been overlooked. Meetings ran as scheduled. Presentations were delivered, numbers were discussed, in precise detail, but beneath all of it, something quieter was at work, something that could not be measured on any report. In the main conference room overlooking the city, Daniel stood at the head of the table, a position he had occupied countless times before. Yet today, he did not begin by speaking. He let the room settle first, letting the silence exist without rushing to fill it. The executives around him waited, not impatiently, but attentively. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but different. "Before we begin," he said, his eyes moving across the room, meeting each person without avoiding or asserting dominance, "there is something I want to address." The words were simple, but they carried weight because they were not rehearsed, they were understood. A few people shifted slightly, recognizing the direction of the moment. Daniel continued. "Yesterday was not just an incident," he said. "It was a reflection." The room remained quiet, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, because everyone there had seen it, had felt it, even if they had not been directly involved. "We talk about standards, about excellence, about leadership," he went on. "But those things mean nothing if they are not applied with awareness." No one interrupted. No one looked away, because this was not correction, it was clarity. Respect is not determined by appearance, by titles, or by assumptions made in a moment. Daniel said, his voice firm but not forceful. "It is revealed by how we choose to treat people when we think no one important is." Watching, the statement settled into the room. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but undeniable. One executive nodded slightly. Another leaned back, absorbing the words, because they were not being told what to do. They were being reminded of what had already been shown. Daniel paused, not for effect, but to let the moment land, then continued into the meeting agenda, transitioning seamlessly, as if the lesson and the work were not separate things, but part of the same standard moving forward. Outside the conference room, the building continued its rhythm, employees moving between floors, conversations flowing, but the difference remained, subtle yet constant, because once something has been seen clearly, it cannot return to being unseen. And somewhere far from the glass towers and marble floors, Evelyn Carter sat in a quiet space of her own choosing, reviewing documents. Her environment simple, unassuming, yet entirely her own. She did not speak of what had happened, did not reflect on it with pride or frustration, because for her, it was not an extraordinary event. It was a familiar one, a moment where the world revealed how quickly it judged and how slowly it understood. And she had long ago learned that true presence does not need to announce itself. It only needs to remain steady long enough for others to recognize it when they are ready. And in that understanding, there was a kind of strength that no title could grant and no mistake could take away. Weeks passed, and while the pace of the building returned to its usual rhythm, the memory of that day did not fade. It settled into the culture in ways no formal policy ever could. New hires learned quickly that presence was not defined by appearance. Seasoned employees found themselves pausing just a second longer before making assumptions, and Daniel Brooks carried the lesson with him in every decision, every interaction, not as a burden, but as a constant reminder of what leadership truly required. One afternoon, as the sunlight once again streamed through the towering windows, casting long reflections across the marble floors, Daniel stood in the lobby, the same place where everything had shifted. He was not waiting for anyone, not expecting anything. He simply stood there, observing, a quiet habit he had developed without realizing it. And then, almost as if time had folded back on itself, the doors opened again, and Evelyn Carter stepped inside, her presence as calm and unassuming as before. No announcement, no attention drawn, just a quiet arrival that could easily be missed by those who were not paying attention. But Daniel noticed immediately, not with surprise, not with tension, but with clarity. He walked toward her, his steps measured, not hurried, not hesitant. When he reached her, he stopped at a respectful distance, not too close, not too far, just enough to acknowledge without imposing. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice steady, without pretense. Evelyn looked at him, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady as always. "Mr. Brooks," she replied, her tone neutral, neither warm nor cold, just present. There was a brief pause, not uncomfortable, not forced, simply real. Daniel nodded once. "I wanted to thank you," he said, choosing his words carefully, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Not for what happened, but for what it revealed. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment, then gave the slightest nod, acknowledging the meaning behind his words. "Most people do not notice the difference," she said quietly, her voice calm. "Until they have to." Daniel exhaled softly, a faint, almost reflective expression crossing his face. "I understand that now," he replied, and for the first time, there was no need to prove anything beyond that, no need to explain, no need to correct the past, because the change had already taken place where it mattered. Evelyn shifted her gaze briefly around the lobby, taking in the space with the same quiet awareness she had always carried. Then she looked back at Daniel. "Then it was not a wasted moment," she said, and with that, she stepped past him, continuing forward without hesitation, without looking back, because she did not need to. Daniel remained where he was, watching for just a second, then turning slightly, his reflection catching in the polished floor beneath him. But this time, it did not carry the same weight. It did not demand the same certainty. It simply existed, steady and unspoken. And as the doors closed once more behind Evelyn Carter, the building continued as it always had. But something within it had changed permanently, not because of power, not because of status, but because for one brief moment, truth had stood quietly in the center of it all, and everyone had been forced to see it. And from that day forward, the space did not just function, it remembered, and in that memory, it carried something far more valuable than authority. It carried understanding. Because respect is not created in moments of comfort, it is revealed in moments of clarity, and once revealed, it becomes something that cannot be taken back, only carried forward.